The U.S. Horizon's engineering deck shuddered as another gravitational wave struck the hull. Marcus Chen braced himself against his workstation, watching as diagnostic readouts flashed from green to amber across his holographic display. The massive research vessel had been tracking quantum anomalies along the Carina Arm when they encountered something their sensors couldn't explain, a region of space where the laws of physics seemed to fold in on themselves. "All hands, prepare for emergency maneuvers," Captain Rivera's voice echoed through the ship-wide comm. "Engineering status report." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the precise, metallic tones of his new colleague. "Captain, this is engineering specialist Katora. Our quantum field generators are operating at 147% of recommended capacity. Protocol dictates immediate power reduction to prevent system failure." "Belay that," Marcus interrupted, his fingers flying across the controls. "We need those generators at maximum to maintain structural integrity through these waves. The safety margins can handle it." He could feel Katora's crystalline eyes boring into him from her station across the deck. The Vraxian engineer's silver-scaled skin caught the pulsing red emergency lights, making her appear to glow with barely contained frustration. Like all her species, she was the product of centuries of careful genetic engineering, designed to be the perfect combination of analytical mind and precision-crafted body. And like all Vraxians, she had an almost religious devotion to procedures and protocols. "Engineer Chen," she said, each word precisely measured, "your suggestion violates 17 separate safety protocols. The probability of catastrophic system failure increases by 3.4% with each passing minute at these power levels." Another gravitational wave hit, stronger than the last. Tools and equipment went flying as the artificial gravity fluctuated. Marcus grabbed a floating wrench out of the air before it could brain him. "And the probability of the hull crumpling like wet paper if we reduce power is exactly 100%. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts." Instinct is an evolutionary holdover that should be discarded in favor of rational analysis, Tora countered, though Marcus noticed she had yet to actually reduce power to the generators. The Vraxian engineering course has extensive data on. The ship's AI cut through their argument with its calm, manufactured voice. "Warning. Hull breach detected in Science Lab 7. Emergency containment protocols engaged. All personnel please proceed to designated evacuation points." Marcus was already moving before the announcement finished, grabbing his emergency repair kit. "Coming?" he called to Katora. She stood frozen for a moment, visible conflict playing across her angular features. "This is not the approved response procedure for a Class 3 hull breach. No, the approved response is to seal off the section and deal with it after the crisis. But there are 3 researchers trapped in that lab." He headed for the access corridor. "So either help me save them, or document all my violations in triplicate. Your choice." He heard her footsteps behind him, quick and precise, before she spoke. "I will assist, but under protest, and I will be documenting everything." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Marcus grinned as they ran through the corridors. The ship shuddered again, and emergency bulkheads began slamming shut around them. They barely made it through the last one before it sealed. "That was unnecessarily reckless," Tora observed as they approached the damaged lab. "We could have been trapped." "But we weren't." Marcus pulled up the structural schematics on his tablet. "Because contrary to what you might think, I actually do calculate the risks. I just do it faster and with less paperwork." Katora's response was cut off by a violent tremor that nearly knocked them off their feet. Warning lights flashed as the hull groaned around them. Through the reinforced windows, Marcus could see the strange quantum distortions warping space itself, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but 1,000,000 times more intense. "The quantum field generators are approaching critical levels," Tora announced, checking her own readings. "We have approximately 12 minutes before catastrophic failure. Then let's make them count." Marcus reached the sealed lab door and began bypassing the security lockouts. I'll get the door. You plot us the fastest route back that won't get us spaced." To his surprise, Tora immediately began working on the evacuation route without argument. "I have identified 3 potential paths, ranked by probability of survival." She paused, then added, "The one with the highest chance of success involves climbing through the plasma conduit maintenance shafts." "Which is definitely against protocols," Marcus noted as he finished the bypass. "As you have already invalidated 43 safety procedures in the past 10 minutes, I calculated that additional violations would be statistically insignificant." Marcus couldn't help but laugh as the door slid open. Was that actually a joke? Maybe there's hope for you yet. The 3 researchers were huddled in environmental suits near the back of the lab, where emergency force fields held back the vacuum of space. Getting them out and through the maintenance shafts would be tricky, but doable. As they began the evacuation, Marcus found himself grateful for Tora's precise nature. Her calculations of handholds and passage times were proving invaluable. They had just gotten the last researcher through when the ship's AI made another announcement. "Warning. Due to extensive damage to crew quarters, emergency redistribution of living spaces is now in effect. All personnel, please check your assigned emergency quarters." Marcus's tablet pinged with a notification. He pulled it up and nearly dropped the device. No way. Tora was looking at her own tablet, her silver scales taking on a distinctly darker hue that Marcus was starting to recognize as her version of a blush. "This is highly irregular." "We've been assigned to share quarters," Marcus read aloud. "Room 2187, single bunk." He looked up at his colleague. "Please tell me there's a protocol for this." "There are protocols for emergency quarters redistribution," she replied stiffly. "They do not, however, account for cross-species cohabitation arrangements." Another tremor rocked the ship. "We should focus on the immediate crisis." "Right." Marcus checked the quantum generator readings. 7 minutes until critical failure. Time to get creative. "I assume by creative you mean violate more protocols." "See, you are learning." They began making their way back to engineering. "Though maybe we can find a compromise. Your precision, my improvisation." Tora was quiet for a moment as they climbed through the maintenance shaft. "That would be interesting to attempt, assuming we survive the next 7 minutes. And assuming we don't kill each other sharing a bunk." "Indeed, though I should inform you that Vraxians require significantly less sleep than humans. I will use the time to properly document today's numerous violations." Marcus grinned as they emerged into engineering. "I'm looking forward to reading that report. Now, let's save this ship." The first night in shared quarters went exactly as well as Marcus expected, which was to say, not at all. He stood in the doorway of room 2187, staring at the narrow bunk that would supposedly accommodate both a human engineer and a Vraxian who apparently never slept. "Your heart rate has increased by 12%, Tora observed from her position by the room's single desk, where she was meticulously logging the day's events. "Are you experiencing distress?" "Just trying to figure out the logistics," Marcus replied, dropping his emergency kit by the door. The room was barely large enough for 2 people to stand without touching. "I assume you've already calculated the exact optimal sleeping arrangements." Naturally. Tora manipulated her holographic display, bringing up a detailed diagram. "Given standard human sleep cycles and space requirements, compared to Vraxian rest periods, I have determined that." A priority alert chimed on both their tablets, cutting her off. Marcus checked the message and groaned. "Quantum drives showing signs of instability. Damage from those gravitational waves must have been worse than we thought." "We should proceed to engineering immediately," Tora said, already moving toward the door. She paused, glancing back at her unfinished report. "Though regulations require all incident documentation be completed within, the ship's not going to explode any slower just because you didn't dot every I." Marcus interrupted, already halfway down the corridor. "Come on. The engineering deck was chaos when they arrived. Warning lights painted everything in shades of red and amber as technicians rushed between workstations. Lieutenant Park, their direct superior, intercepted them at the entrance. "Good, you're here," she said, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she hadn't slept since the crisis began. "The quantum drive's containment field is fluctuating. We need solutions fast." "Show me the readings," Tora demanded, moving to the nearest console. Her scaled fingers danced across the holographic interface as data scrolled past. "The field harmonics are degrading at an exponential rate. Standard stabilization protocols are proving ineffective." Marcus studied the readouts over her shoulder, close enough to notice that her scales shifted color slightly at his proximity. The gravitational waves must have knocked the field emitters out of alignment. "We need to recalibrate the entire array." "Impossible," Katora stated flatly. "A full recalibration requires complete shutdown of the quantum drive. We are currently traveling at FTL velocities, shutting down mid-flight would." "Tear the ship apart, yeah." Marcus ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Unless we do it in stages. Recalibrate one emitter at a time while the others compensate." Katora's crystalline eyes narrowed. "That procedure is not in any manual I have studied. The risk factors alone are better than definitely exploding." Marcus pulled up the emitter schematics. "Look, I know it's not protocol, but sometimes protocols have to evolve. You adapted to the maintenance shaft situation yesterday, right?" That was different, but she was studying the schematics intently. The power fluctuations would be extreme. One miscalculation and the containment field could collapse entirely. "Then it's a good thing I have the most precise engineer in the fleet to handle the calculations." He gave her what he hoped was an encouraging smile. "Your math, my crazy ideas, remember." Katora was quiet for a long moment, her scales shifting through subtle color variations that Marcus was starting to recognize as signs of internal conflict. Finally, she spoke. "I will need 17 minutes to calculate the exact power requirements for each stage of the recalibration." "You have 5, Lieutenant Park cut in. "The containment field won't hold much longer than that." 5 minutes is insufficient for proper analysis." "Then do improper analysis," Marcus suggested. "Sometimes good enough has to be good enough." Tora's hands clenched briefly before returning to the console. "I will attempt to expedite my calculations, but I maintain that this entire approach is dangerously reckless." "Noted. I'm sure it'll take up at least 3 pages in your report." Marcus began preparing the emitter controls. "While you're calculating, want to finish telling me your optimal sleeping arrangement plan. You believe this is an appropriate time for such discussions. We're about to attempt an impossible engineering feat that could either save the ship or blow us all to atoms. Seems like as good a time as any." To his surprise, Tora's scales flickered with what might have been amusement. "Very well. Given the bunk's dimensions, I determined that alternating sleep cycles would be most efficient. However, during the brief periods of overlap, the optimal arrangement would require you to sleep on your left side while I—" Another warning klaxon cut through the air. The containment field's stability had dropped another 12%. "Tell me later," Marcus said, positioning himself at the primary control station, ready to get creative. Tora's fingers flew across her console, faster than he'd ever seen her work. "Calculations are at 89% completion. They are not as precise as I would prefer, but," she paused, then added quietly, "I am learning to trust that good enough must sometimes be good enough." "Progress." Marcus grinned. "Next thing you know, you'll be breaking protocols just for fun." That seems unlikely, but there was something almost like humor in her tone. Initial calculations complete, beginning power redistribution to the first emitter array. And Marcus. "Yeah. When we return to our quarters, I believe I may have identified an alternative sleeping arrangement that violates fewer spatial efficiency protocols." Marcus laughed despite the crisis unfolding around them. Can't wait to hear it. Now, let's see if we can save this ship without blowing ourselves up. The quantum drive hummed ominously as they began their dangerous dance of mathematics and intuition, precision and improvisation, and somewhere between the possibility of catastrophic explosion and the certainty of an awkward living arrangement, two very different engineers started to find their rhythm. "You move my tools." Marcus's accusation broke the pre-dawn quiet of room 2187. He stood over his workbench, or rather, the half-meter of desk space Tora had allocated him in her meticulously calculated room organization scheme. "I optimized their arrangement based on usage frequency and ergonomic efficiency," Tora replied without looking up from her terminal. "Your previous system was," she paused, searching for a diplomatic term, "chaotic." "It was organized chaos. I knew where everything was." He picked up a plasma cutter that had been precisely aligned with the edge of the desk. "There's a difference between efficiency and—" The ship's emergency alert system screamed to life, cutting him off. Red warning lights bathed the small room in crimson as Captain Rivera's voice crackled through the comm. "All hands to emergency stations. Multiple explosions detected in Engineering Section C. This is not a drill." Marcus and Tora moved in perfect synchronization, their argument forgotten as they grabbed their emergency kits and rushed into the corridor. 3 days of sharing quarters had at least taught them the dance of moving in small spaces without collision. Engineering Section C houses the primary coolant systems, Tora noted as they ran. Her silver scales reflected the emergency lighting, creating shifting patterns along the walls. A failure there could trigger a cascade reaction throughout the entire power grid. Could this be related to the quantum drive repairs? Marcus asked, ducking under a closing emergency bulkhead. Negative. Our recalibration procedures, while unorthodox, were successful. These explosions suggest deliberate sabotage. They rounded the final corner to Engineering Section C and stopped short. The main access corridor was blocked by debris, sparking cables hanging from the ceiling like wounded serpents. Through the reinforced observation window, they could see flames dancing between the coolant tanks. "Primary access is compromised," Tora announced, already pulling up structural schematics on her tablet. "Alternative routes air." Another explosion rocked the ship, stronger than the first. Marcus stumbled, catching himself against the wall as emergency bulkheads slammed down around them. Warning klaxons shifted pitch, indicating a new threat. "Hull breach detected," the ship's AI announced calmly. "Emergency containment protocols engaged. Warning, Engineering Section C will decompress in 10 minutes. "We're sealed in," Marcus realized, checking the bulkhead controls. "Emergency overrides aren't responding." That should not be possible given current security protocols. Taurus scales had darkened to a stormy gray, her species equivalent of pallor, unless someone wanted to make sure no one could stop whatever's happening in there. Marcus gestured toward the burning coolant section. "Any chance those precise Vraxian senses of yours can tell what kind of explosives were used?" Tora's crystalline eyes narrowed as she studied the debris pattern. The blast radius and residual energy signatures are consistent with Centaurian thermal charges. Highly regulated, difficult to obtain without significant military or corporate connections. Great. We're trapped between sealed bulkheads and a ticking time bomb, probably set by someone with high-level access. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a habit Tora had noted occurred most frequently when he was formulating what she called his procedurally questionable solutions. "The coolant system must be stabilized before decompression occurs," she said. "Otherwise, the entire engineering deck could be compromised." Marcus was already pulling tools from his kit. "We can get through the maintenance shaft above the auxiliary power conduits. It'll be tight, but..." That route passes directly through a section exposed to coolant radiation. Even with protective gear, we would receive a lethal dose within minutes. "Then we'll have to work fast." He began removing an access panel from the ceiling. Unless you've got a better idea that doesn't involve waiting for proper authorization while we all explode. Taurus scales rippled with conflicting colors. I do not. But this plan has a survival probability of less than 12%. See, we're getting better at compromising. You did the math, I ignored it, and we both pretend the numbers don't terrify us. He pulled himself up into the access shaft, then reached down to help her. Coming. She grasped his hand without hesitation, her scaled skin cool and smooth against his. Your ability to maintain humor in statistically hopeless situations continues to confound me. Stick with me long enough, and you might even develop some yourself. He began crawling through the cramped shaft, trying to ignore how the metal groaned around them. Though fair warning, human humor often violates protocol. I have noticed. Her voice was dry but carried an undercurrent of something almost like fondness. For instance, your latest modification to the room organization spreadsheet. Chaos Corner is not an officially recognized storage designation. Marcus chuckled as they approached the radiation zone. Had to do something while you were calculating the optimal shower schedule down to the microsecond. He paused at a junction, checking his tablet's radiation readings. Ready for this? No. But necessity often overrides readiness. She moved beside him, her movements precise even in the confined space. The coolant stabilization procedure will require both of us working in perfect synchronization. Good thing we've had practice sharing that tiny bunk. We have not shared the bunk. I specifically calculated our rest periods to prevent overlap. Yet you still somehow managed to leave silver scales all over my pillow. Perhaps if you had not disrupted my organized storage system, I would not have shed due to elevated stress responses. Their banter carried them through the radiation zone, helping mask the anxiety as their radiation badges slowly darkened. They reached the coolant section access point just as the ship's AA announced, 5 minutes until decompression. Marcus dropped down into the burning room, immediately assaulted by heat and the acrid smell of melting circuitry. Katora landed beside him with characteristic grace, already moving toward the primary coolant controls. The stabilization sequence requires simultaneous activation of 3 separate systems, she announced, fingers flying across the damaged console. Timing must be precise to within 0.3 seconds. Like that time you calculated exactly how long it would take you to reorganize my chaotic tool collection. Marcus positioned himself at the secondary controls. That was significantly less likely to result in our molecular dispersal across space-time. She pulled up the activation sequence, though your resistance to organizational efficiency was similarly hazardous. You love it. Admits it. I've added excitement to your by-the-book life. What I will admit is that your unorthodox methods have occasionally yielded positive results. Occasionally. Her scales flickered with concentration as she fine-tuned the sequence. Ready? Marcus nodded, hands hovering over the controls. Together on your mark. As they worked to prevent a catastrophic meltdown, both engineers knew something had fundamentally shifted between them. Somewhere between regulation and chaos, precision and instinct, they'd found a balance neither had expected. And as the coolant systems slowly stabilized under their combined efforts, Marcus couldn't help but think that maybe sharing quarters wasn't the worst punishment the universe had devised after all. Even if Katora did keep reorganizing his tools. The ship's medical bay hummed with quiet efficiency as doctors treated Marcus and Katora for radiation exposure. They sat on adjacent beds while regeneration units worked to repair the cellular damage from their coolant system adventure. Your reckless actions directly violated 17 safety protocols, 2 military regulations, and 1 interstellar treaty regarding radiation exposure limits, Katora stated, checking the numbers on her medical display. You're slipping, Marcus replied with a weak grin. Usually it's at least 20 protocols. The regeneration process left him feeling drained, but alive, which was better than the alternative. Besides, you were right there with me. I was implementing emergency containment procedures under duress. Is that what we're calling it in the official report? Before Tora could respond, Lieutenant Park entered the medical bay, her expression grim. We found something in the wreckage. The thermal charges were military grade, and they were activated using command-level access codes. Marcus sat up straighter, ignoring the wave of dizziness. Someone high up in the chain of command is trying to sabotage the ship. That would explain the override failures, Tora added, her scales shifting to a deeper silver, a color Marcus had learned indicated intense focus. Standard security protocols could be bypassed with sufficient authorization. Park glanced around the medical bay before continuing in a lower voice. The captain wants this investigated quietly. We can't trust the normal channels if someone with command access is involved. She fixed them both with a stern look. I'm assigning you two to run a covert diagnostic of all critical systems. Find out if anything else has been tampered with. That would require accessing restricted systems without proper authorization, Tora pointed out. The regulations specifically prohibit. The regulations also prohibit trying to blow up your own ship, Marcus interrupted. I think we're a bit past worrying about proper paperwork. Tora's scales rippled with conflicting colors before settling into a pattern Marcus recognized as resignation. I will document these violations under the emergency response protocols. That's the spirit. Marcus swung his legs off the bed, waiting for the room to stop spinning. Where do we start? Your quarters, Park replied. We're setting up a secure terminal there. Keep this between us. We don't know who else might be compromised. After Park left, Marcus turned to Tora with a slight smirk. Looks like we'll be spending even more quality time in our cozy little room. The space is adequate for its intended purpose. You calculated the exact cubic centimeters of adequate, didn't you? Obviously, she paused, then added, though your tendency to leave personal items in statistically improbable locations has required several recalculations. Back in room 2187, they found a new secure terminal had been installed on Tora's meticulously organized desk. She stared at the disruption to her system with what Marcus swore was horror. We can reorganize later, he promised, pulling up the ship's diagnostic protocols. Right now, we need to figure out who's trying to kill us all. Tora settled into her usual precise posture at the terminal. The number of crew members with sufficient access to override safety protocols and obtain military-grade explosives is relatively small. Cross-referencing with personnel records and security logs showed. She stopped abruptly, scales darkening. What is it? Marcus leaned in to see her screen. The security logs for Engineering Section C show authorized access just before the explosions. But the crew member listed, she brought up the personnel file. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen. That's impossible, Marcus said. She's been on leave for the past 3 months. I know it because she's my sister. Precisely, which means someone used her credentials without authorization. Tora's fingers flew across the interface. But to do so would require intimate knowledge of both military systems and personal authorization codes. Someone on the inside working with someone on the outside, Marcus suggested, pacing the small room. The question is why? What's so special about this ship that's worth sabotaging? Tora was quiet for a moment, her scales shifting through thoughtful patterns. The quantum anomalies we were studying. They were unlike anything previously recorded. The data could be extremely valuable to certain, interested parties. Valuable enough to kill for. There are corporations and governments who would pay astronomical sums for advanced quantum technology. She hesitated, then added, including some within the Vraxian engineering course. Marcus stopped pacing. You think your people might be involved? The Vraxian approach to technological advancement is absolute, efficiency above all else. Her scales had darkened to a deep, troubled gray. There are those who would consider a few casualties statistically acceptable in exchange for such data. But you don't. I am beginning to understand that there are factors beyond statistical acceptance. She met his eyes. Working with you has been educationally disruptive. Pretty sure that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. He grinned, then grew serious. So how do we prove who's behind this without getting ourselves spaced? We will need to access the quantum research data directly. Compare it with known corporate and military interests. Her scales shifted again. However, the level of system access required would violate approximately 37 regulations. Only 37. We must be losing our touch. Marcus pulled up the research lab schematics. How long will it take you to bypass the security? With proper authorization and documentation, 3 days, she began typing. Without such protocols, approximately 12 minutes. See, I am a bad influence. You are expanding my procedural flexibility. Her tone was dry but carried that hint of warmth he'd started noticing more often. Though I maintain that your sock storage methodology defies both physics and reason. They worked through the night, searching for patterns in the data that might reveal their saboteur. Marcus noticed that Tora didn't once mention her usual precise sleep schedule, and he managed to avoid disrupting her organized systems too badly. They had found their rhythm, her exactitude tempering his chaos, his intuition challenging her rigidity. As ship's dawn approached, bringing with it new warning signals from the quantum drive, both engineers knew they were running out of time. Someone was willing to destroy the entire ship to get what they wanted, and the only ones who could stop them were a human who played fast and loose with the rules, and a Vraxian who was learning that sometimes the most important protocols were the unwritten ones. Red emergency lights cast moving shadows across room 2187 as Marcus and Tora pored over the quantum research data. 3 days of investigation had left them with too many questions and not enough sleep, at least for Marcus. Tora claimed Vraxians could go weeks without rest, though the slightly darker sheen of her scales suggested otherwise. There's definitely a pattern here, Marcus said, gesturing at the holographic display floating above their shared desk. The sabotage attempts all coincide with major breakthroughs in the quantum field research. Agreed, the timing correlates with statistically significant probability. Tora manipulated the data stream with precise movements. However, the command codes used in each incident are from different officers, making it difficult to. The ship's lighting shifted to deep purple, the signal for imminent quantum drive activation. But something was wrong. The usual low hum of the drive had a discordant note that made Marcus's teeth ache. That's not supposed to happen, he said, already moving toward the door. Not after we recalibrated there. The deck lurched violently, throwing them both against the wall. Warning klaxons screamed as the ship's AA announced, "Critical quantum field instability detected. Containment failure imminent. All hands prepare for emergency protocols." Tora was already pulling up engineering diagnostics on her tablet. Someone has overridden our safety measures and initiated an unstable quantum jump. At current fluctuation levels, the drive will breach in approximately 7 minutes. Can we shut it down remotely? Negative. All command functions have been locked out. Her scales rippled with rapid calculations. We need to reach the drive control room physically. They burst into the corridor, joining the stream of crew members rushing to emergency stations. Marcus's tablet chimed with an incoming message from Lieutenant Park. Bridge locked down. Captains missing. Drive activation came from auxiliary control. This is it, Marcus said as they ran. Whoever's behind the sabotage is making their final move. Accessing auxiliary control requires Level 1 command authorization, Tora noted. The number of personnel with such access is extremely limited. They reached the engineering deck to find chaos. The quantum drive's containment chamber pulsed with sickly purple light, its usual precise geometries warping in ways that hurt to look at. Engineering crews worked frantically at their stations while emergency barriers slammed into place. The containment field is already starting to fail, Tora announced, checking the nearest console. These energy readings are beyond anything in our databases. Marcus studied the readouts, his face grim. They're trying to force the drive to interact with those quantum anomalies we were studying. But why? The power levels would tear the ship apart. Unless that's precisely the intended outcome. Taurus scales had shifted to a deep, alarmed silver. The drive isn't meant to survive this. It's meant to create something else. A controlled quantum breach that would generate new forms of exotic matter. Worth a fortune to whoever could study it, Marcus realized. Even if it costs the lives of everyone on board. He started toward the drive control room, then stopped as a new alarm sounded. Warning, the ship's AI announced. Emergency containment protocols engaged. Drive control room access sealed due to critical radiation levels. They've locked down the control room, Marcus growled in frustration. We can't get in without. There is another way. Tora's voice was unusually quiet. The maintenance shaft we use to reach the coolant system. It passes near enough to the quantum drive's primary control circuits. That area will be flooded with radiation even worse than last time, Marcus protested. The containment field is already failing. We have minutes at most before. 3.4 minutes, assuming current degradation rates. Her scales rippled with complex emotions. Sufficient time to reach the circuits and initiate an emergency shutdown. For one person with the necessary technical expertise. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he understood. No, we do this together or not at all. That would be inefficient. The shaft can barely fit one person, and the radiation exposure would. I don't care about efficient. I'm not letting you sacrifice yourself. Tora's crystalline eyes met his. This is a logical solution. Vraxians are more resistant to radiation than humans. I have the necessary knowledge to override the drive controls. And her scales shifted to a soft, almost gentle silver. You have taught me that sometimes protecting what matters requires breaking protocol. Before Marcus could argue further, she moved with characteristic Vraxian speed and precision. In one fluid motion, she activated the maintenance shaft access panel and slipped inside, sealing it behind her. Tora. Marcus slammed his hand against the panel. Don't you dare. I have initiated emergency lockout procedures. Her voice came through his tablet. You cannot follow. It would be pointless to attempt to bypass them in the available time frame. You calculated exactly how long it would take me to hack it, didn't you? Obviously. There was that warmth in her voice again, almost hidden under the professional tone. I have learned to account for your chaos in all my equations. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cold metal of the access panel. This isn't fair. I never got to show you how much more efficient my SOC storage system could be. A sound that might have been a laugh. Your influence on my organizational protocols has been statistically significant. Background radiation alarms screamed through the tablet connection. I need to focus now. The shutdown sequence requires precise timing. Tora, wait. I know. Her voice was soft. Your chaos has made my ordered universe considerably more interesting. Now, let me do what I do best, follow procedures to their logical conclusion. The tablet connection cut off as she moved deeper into the radiation zone. Marcus stared at the sealed panel, surrounded by flashing warnings and emergency klaxons, feeling more helpless than he had in his entire engineering career. Then his eyes fell on the quantum drive schematics still displayed on the nearest console, and an impossible idea began to form. The kind of idea that violated every safety protocol ever written. The kind of idea that would make Tora recalculate every probability table she'd ever created. The kind of idea that just might save them both if he could pull it off in the next 2 minutes and 47 seconds. Because some protocols were meant to be broken, and some chaos was worth any risk to preserve. Marcus Chen had never moved so fast in his life. His fingers flew across the engineering console, breaking every safety protocol he'd ever learned as he rewired the quantum drive's emergency systems. What he was attempting shouldn't be possible, but then nothing about his partnership with Katora had ever fit the standard probability curves. Warning, the ship's AI announced. Quantum containment failure in 2 minutes. All personnel proceed to emergency escape pods. He ignored the evacuation orders, focused entirely on the complex equations flowing across his screen. Kotaro would have done the calculations perfectly, accounted for every variable. He had to rely on intuition and desperate hope. "Come on," he muttered, rerouting power from life support to strengthen what remained of the containment field. "Just hold together a little longer." His tablet crackled with static before Katora's voice emerged, weaker than before. "Marcus, the radiation levels are higher than anticipated. I've reached the primary circuits, but I know." He continued working as he spoke. "Your calculations were off for once, probably because you didn't factor in one chaos-inducing variable." "What are you doing?" Her tone sharpened despite her obvious fatigue. "The engineering sensors show massive power fluctuations. You're exceeding every known safety limit. Remember when you said I taught you that protecting what matters means breaking protocol?" His hands never stopped moving across the controls. "Well, you taught me something too. Sometimes the craziest plans work better with precise calculations." "Marcus." Warning crept into her voice. "Whatever you're planning." "I'm going to use the quantum drive's instability to create a localized time dilation field. Just for a few seconds, but long enough to get you out of there before the radiation exposure becomes lethal." Silence filled the comm channel. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "That's theoretically impossible. The power requirements alone. Which is why I'm dumping every bit of power we have into the containment field. When it fails, the quantum surge should create a bubble of distorted spacitime. Like those anomalies we were studying, but controlled. Mostly controlled, somewhat controlled. The probability of success is infinitesimal. The calculations would need to be absolutely perfect, accounting for variables we barely understand." Marcus allowed himself a grim smile as he made the final adjustments. "Good thing I spent the last few weeks living with the most precise engineer in the fleet. Some of that math had to rub off." More alarms joined the cacophony as systems redlined throughout the ship. The quantum drive's housing groaned under impossible stresses, reality itself seeming to bend around the containment chamber. "Warning," the AI announced. "Containment failure in 30 seconds. Marcus." Tora's voice was stronger now, filled with something that might have been fear or might have been hope. "This plan is completely insane." "Yeah, but you know what's really insane?" He positioned his finger over the final command sequence. "I actually did organize my socks according to your efficiency protocols. Turns out some order in the chaos isn't such a bad thing." Before she could respond, he activated the sequence. The quantum drive's containment field collapsed in a carefully calculated cascade, releasing a controlled surge of exotic particles. For one eternal moment, the laws of physics bent like rubber bands stretched to their breaking point. Then reality snapped back into place with a thunderclap that shook the entire ship. Emergency lights flickered and died, plunging engineering into darkness before auxiliary power kicked in. Marcus was moving before the spots cleared from his vision, racing to the maintenance shaft access panel. His tablet showed radiation levels dropping rapidly as the quantum drive powered down. He bypassed the security lockouts, noting with some pride that it took him exactly as long as Katora had calculated, and pulled open the panel. She all but fell into his arms, her silver scales dulled by radiation exposure, but still shifting with life. He caught her, supporting her weight as her precise Vraxian balance failed for perhaps the first time in her life. That, she managed between ragged breaths, violated approximately 112 separate safety protocols, not to mention several laws of physics. Only 112. I must be losing my touch. He helped her toward the medical bay, relief making him lightheaded. Or maybe that was the radiation exposure. Don't worry, I'll make up for it by completely reorganizing our room when you're better. Total chaos. You will do no such thing. Despite her weakness, her tone carried absolute certainty. I have finally achieved optimal efficiency in our shared space. Even with my socks. Your sock storage has been integrated into the overall system. Her scales flickered with what might have been embarrassment. I have learned that some elements of chaos can enhance rather than disrupt efficiency. They reached the medical bay just as Lieutenant Park's voice came over the ship-wide comm. Security teams to auxiliary control. Saboteurs in custody. Drive systems stabilizing. All personnel return to stations. See, Marcus said as medical staff swarmed around them with regeneration units. Everything worked out. Because you ignored all protocols and attempted an impossible manipulation of quantum mechanics. Taurus scales were already regaining their healthy sheen under the regeneration field's influence. It was reckless, dangerous, and she paused, then added quietly, "Thank you. Hey, you broke plenty of protocols yourself these past few weeks. I think we've both learned to bend a little." Perhaps. She settled onto a medical bed, her precise posture returning. Though I maintain that your original sock storage methodology was genuinely offensive to all rational beings. Marcus laughed, then winced as the regeneration field began repairing his radiation damage. Just wait until you see what I do with the tool bench when we get back. You will do nothing of the sort. I have calculated the optimal arrangement for maximum efficiency while allowing for your creative tendencies. In other words, you figure out how to contain my chaos within your order. Her scales rippled with that now familiar warmth. I prefer to think of it as achieving a sustainable synthesis, though I will still document every protocol violation. I wouldn't have it any other way. As the medical staff worked around them, Human and Vraxian shared a look of perfect understanding. They had saved their ship, caught the saboteurs, and, most improbably of all, found a balance between precision and chaos that made them both better engineers. And if that balance happened to make sharing a small room with a single bunk more interesting than either had expected, well, that was one protocol violation they could both live with. The end.